And thank you for coming to our first lecture series of the set that we have. We only have 2 this year. Last year we did 7 and I said, woo, that was too many. This year we're gonna do 2. And this is our first one and I'm excited to get started. So first off, my name is Natasha Wingreen and I'm the Outreach Director at New Haven Reads. Just a little bit about New Haven Reads. Our mission is to increase literacy skills of children by providing individually tailored one-on-one after-school tutoring, educational family support, and a community book bank, all at no cost to participants. In addition to our free book bank and our one-on-one tutoring, New Haven Reads offers early readiness classes for pre-K and kindergarten students, as well as resources for teachers. Together with community members like you, we're building a community of readers. While our programming has had to adapt these past years, we continue to support our students and families through a hybrid of online and in-person tutoring. We just started our summer program, so this is a really good way to start it off as well. Through these lecture series, we are excited to hear from those likewise invested in promoting literacy and expanding educational access, and to share this experience and knowledge with the wider New Haven Reads community. So thank you so much for joining today. So a few housekeeping items to help ensure a quality experience for all. Please keep yourself on mute so that it helps the audio. We will be recording this event and sharing a link with those who registered, as well as putting it on our website and putting it out in a blog post. To see the speaker only, please adjust to the speaker view in the upper right-hand corner. And then following the lecture, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. So please do so by typing a message in the chat function of the Zoom, and then I will facilitate the responses from the guest speakers. Moving on to the guest speakers. So we are super thrilled to invite Stella Betts and Dave Levin. They are a firm called Levin Betts, and this is an award-winning New York City-based architecture practice founded by David Levin and Stella Betts in 1997. The practice focuses on design at a range of scales, including urban design, public architecture, housing and housing, commercial workspaces, exhibitions, and furniture. David and Stella have taught at both the undergrad and graduate level. David is an associate professor at Parsons School of Design and has taught previously at Cornell University School of Design and has taught School of Art and Architecture and Planning, City College, and Syracuse University School of Architecture. Stella is currently teaching at Yale University School of Architecture and Cornell University School of Art and Architecture and Planning. She has taught previously at Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, Cooper Union, and Syracuse University School of Architecture. Levin Betts' work has been recognized nationally and internationally through awards, exhibitions, and publications. The office has won 11 New York City AIA awards and is currently working on its 5th New York City Public Library, a 300,000 square foot life science laboratory building, a museum exhibition for a house prototype, and a series of pavilions and residential projects. Please welcome Stella and David.
Thanks,
you.
Natasha.
Thank you, Natasha, for that
Thanks,
introduction.
everybody.
We're super excited to be here and to speak about libraries today because it's a real important part of our practice and something that we're really passionate about. And we've taught a lot in our studios about libraries. So,
And thanks for coming out on a Saturday.
Yeah, thank you for coming. So we're going to go ahead and share our screen. Is that okay?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Okay, can you see that?
Sure can.
Okay, great. So we wanted to start by just telling you a little bit about our practice. Natasha thank you for that introduction.
Yeah, and as Natasha said, we work at a whole bunch of different scales in our practice. This is just a grid of images, kind of cutting across these different types of projects that we work on. We're really committed to civic buildings, really in the form of these public libraries, branch libraries specifically. We work on houses as well, museum exhibitions. In the middle of the screen, you see a little picture of that big building that Natasha mentioned. It's that building in Harlem. It's a life sciences laboratory building that we're currently wrapping up. And, we really love to engage all these different types of projects. It just, we learn things at every scale, every type, every client. And that's really the fun practicing the way we do. Our office is in the Chelsea neighborhood in Manhattan. We're right on the High Line, which is kind of wonderful because we just see people walking by on that park, the elevated park, all day long. As you can see in some of these images, we're really interested in the making of architecture and studying architecture through model making a lot. We find that it really helps to visualize and help people see the spaces that they're going to be living or working in.
So we wanted to, as David said, we have a kind of wide range of projects that we work on in the office, but we're very, very committed and excited about our library project. So of course, speaking with you guys today, we wanted to talk about the free libraries, and we wanted to talk about them in several different ways. As libraries as a civic building and the way that it performs and operates within the city, within the neighborhoods, within the communities. And so what is a library as a civic building within its urban or rural context? What does it mean for that community? We also are really interested at the scale of the library, just the building. How is the building organized? How does the building become something welcoming within that community? So obviously it's directly related to that relationship of how the building is situated in its site, but also again, just how is it organized? And we're going to talk a lot about the sort of change in libraries over the last century and half a century particularly. And then of course the books, and we sort of say books plus because as I think we all are becoming familiar that libraries have changed so much over the more recent years in the last 50 years or so, where they're doing much more than just being containers for books, but many other types of program are occurring within libraries themselves. So we're going to be talking at these kind of three scales,
which are really, Natosha, in your prompt about urbanism, equity, and the joy of reading. And so we're really going to hit on those topics through, as Stella said, historical examples and images and examples of our work.
So, we won't go through a long lecture. A longer lecture would be a little bit more on the history of the library, but so we're going to kind of do a rapid fire and touch on a couple of aspects of the history of the library that has been important to us. But first thinking about, where did libraries start? And traditionally libraries were more private collections. They were more for the elite. And so the original libraries were again part of like palaces. They were also, or they were a collection through monasteries often. And then there were some libraries like the Alexandria Library in Egypt that was really a collection of all books. It was kind of the equivalent of our Library of Congress. But again, generally these were more private libraries. And what we want to talk a little bit about today really quickly is go through when kind of the first public library started, at least the first that was recorded. There's a lot of speculation about earlier libraries that seem to have been more public, even though traditionally many of them were more private. So one of the first public libraries that is acknowledged to be the first public library was in 1850 by an architect, Henri Labrouste, in Paris, called Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève. And actually, one of the reasons that I think this library became public had to do with gas lamps and the fact that they were building buildings in non-combustible materials, so stone and cast iron. And it allowed the library to stay open at night because of the gas lamps, which meant that university students in Paris could come and study in the library in the evening. And it also meant people that were working during the day could come to the library. So just the fact that the library could be open at night turned it into more of a public library. So it's the first library that really acknowledges being a public library. Although again, there's many other libraries earlier that speculate on that they were letting people in. But this idea of a free library to come and study and learn and read is really important aspect. And also just then thinking about the architecture of the library and the quality of light. In this case, as you see the light coming in from the side, which is something we're going to talk about as well, as these sort of central large reading rooms. And then what's really, really important for us, especially here in the US, but also is a very different, taking the public library step further, was Andrew Carnegie and his campaign for public libraries, many of which were about 1,600 that occurred in the US, but also in other places in Europe. But I think what's particularly significant to us, and it relates directly to our work, is that these were branch libraries. So unlike the sort of large central libraries, which we're going to show some of those as well, where they're located in centers of larger urban cities, Carnegie was philanthropic in the sense that he then funded a lot of libraries in smaller neighborhoods, neighborhoods that were often didn't have access or transportation to these libraries. And so the branch libraries became really, really significant, which is probably something that we all, many of us kind of, I think, have had maybe at least as many experiences with our branch library as we do with our central library.
And we're seeing so much different programming happening in these branch libraries. So the central library is always this very impressive place, and for the collection of books and these amazing spaces. Branch libraries are obviously much smaller, but they're really part of this system that goes out into the community and provides for a whole range of services, as Stella was saying, especially now where services are changing from school lunches for children to maker spaces, help with doing your taxes, a whole range of services that the library programming is now changing.
These branch libraries are kind of doing all the heavy lifting.
And Carnegie's program was really, for literacy, to really increase literacy and access for everybody. Actually, it was incredibly forward thinking in that way. Yeah.
So, but then backing up to then as equally important, but the main central library in a place like New York City, and then also thinking about it in terms of still a container of books. So we're kind of doing like little bits of the history of the library, but here where the reading room became so important as this kind of naturally lit, which was common to the sort of central reading rooms, but then, where the stacks, the collection of books was actually below ground. So the lower right-hand slide is showing how deep the New York Public Library, all the stacks are below the actual reading room. And so that kind of retrieval system really transformed the library.
And then at a similar time to Carnegie's literacy and building campaign in Sweden, they were also undergoing a whole kind of resurgence, or a whole effort towards increasing literacy. And the Central Library in Stockholm, designed by an architect named Erik Gunnar Asplund, was really like the center of those type of ideas to increase literacy. It was a very beautiful space, also capturing light from above and bringing it into the central drum that you see in these two images. So this idea of learning and elevation and beautiful spaces was part of increasing literacy as well, which is so interesting at this time in history.
And then I think really a kind of radical transformation in 1971. Piano and Rogers Architects did a project in Paris, France, which some of you may be familiar with, the Centre Pompidou. It was actually started as a library. Many people, I think of it as, which it also included, was a modern art museum. It has theaters, but this was really radical on so many different levels in terms of the way we're thinking about cities, buildings, and books. First of all, it took the library program and completely expanded it to include a museum, theater, commercial spaces, cafe. So it really started to say, okay, the library has like all these other programs, and really breaking out of traditional libraries of being containers for books. But also, as you can see in the upper left-hand image, really transforming what a library looks like as a civic building. A lot of transparency, this sort of circulation system, the mechanical systems on the outside, so a very different type of look of a civic space. And then equally important to us, the idea that the sort of public space around the Pompidou in Paris, so that not only the building itself free library with this other program, but then the civic space on the outside in the middle of Paris, where everything from just gathering space, political activity, like this being part of the civic space of the city and really transforming that aspect of the city.
So once again, Natosha's brief about urbanism as part of what a library is and can be is really, really on display at the Pompidou Center. For those of you who know it, there's that sort of gently sloping plaza that really is the foreground for the viewing of that building. And as Stella said, it's a place where so many things happen, and they're very, very sort of central to that part of the city.
And then in 2001, that was kind of, I think, picking up on a lot of what was happening at the Pompidou, all the way over back in Japan. The architect Toyo Ito did the Sendai Mediatek Library, and that is very similar in a way, from a building and facade standpoint, very transparent, taking on a lot of different programs. This was a media library, but it also similarly took on program that was beyond a sort of traditional library program as a way to have a large kind of community building. And as you see in the lower right-hand image, this idea of transparency where outdoor public space, urban space, the street flows directly into the space of the library itself. So this very welcoming idea of bringing people into the library, still very much a container of books and other media arts, but just this similar idea of what we saw in Paris.
It's very interesting in this library, especially in the year in 2001, where in kind of like library thinking, there was a lot of questioning of whether the book was going to go away because of the advent of other types of media, the internet and things like that. And the Mediatek bundles all the different types of media. From digital. It's so interesting is that the book never went away, and it's not going away, and we celebrate that and the fact that there are all different types of media and programs that can occur in libraries. So this building was kind of built at a very interesting moment in the sort of thinking around libraries and the book.
And then, which you may be familiar with, finally, in Seattle around 2004, again, another public library, but one that really took on more, as almost like a community facility, many other programs beyond a sort of traditional library. So we kind of wanted to set that up as a background for the way that we want to now talk about some of the libraries that we do within our office, and which are all branch libraries. So we've been fortunate enough to be working on 5 libraries within the New York City area, 4 in Brooklyn and 1 for Queens. So 4 for the Brooklyn Public Library System and 1 for the Queens Library System. So they all, because they're all branch libraries, they're all actually very similar in size around their footprint. They're like with the ground floor plan is all around 8,000 square feet. A couple of these libraries have multiple floors, but very interesting, at least within the New York City region, that this is kind of all the libraries seem to be very similar in size. So these are just some of the models of these different libraries that we have worked on and are currently working on within the office. But today we're just going to quickly talk about 3, which is based on the title of our lecture, with 3 ways of looking at a library, 3 branch libraries in 3 very different neighborhoods. So we're going to start with the Brooklyn Heights Library in Brooklyn, New York.
So this is a library, it's an interim library. So when Brooklyn Public Library, which is the library entity, they own 63 buildings throughout Brooklyn. They were building a new library for a branch library nearby. And so they needed an interim library. So they asked us to design this library in the parish hall of an existing church building. It's called Our Lady of Lebanon, and it's in the neighborhood of Brooklyn Heights, which is a sort of a famous, Brooklyn neighborhood.
So it was really,
it's important.
It was a challenge in a lot of ways, because I think what's really important, and going back to Carnegie, is like these different neighborhoods having branch libraries and that they're idiosyncratic to the neighborhood. So creating an identity, I think, is really important. In this case, we had to create an identity of a library within the identity of a church, and the church community was still going to be using parts of the church. So we really had to put a library inside a church and think of ways to kind of create that identity. This is just an image of one of the back walls where we were starting to play with very informal graphics along one of the back walls of the church. Again, this was sort of a temporary library. It was temporary for 5 years while they were building out the other library.
So this picture is of the before. This was it was a parish hall. The church had events in there. So it was a long, thin space with light only at pretty much two ends, a little bit on the side. So it was the challenge was to keep natural light coming into the space, so it didn't feel dark and kind of. It also shouldn't. We didn't want it to feel temporary. We wanted it to feel like a place that the people in the community were proud of and would love to go. And so. You want to talk about that?
Oh, no, go ahead.
So, we kind of architecturally had to make like a very simple, organization. And what you're seeing in this little model that we made was this curving wall that we called the bookworm. And the wall, curved around to kind of create different spaces.
And it was a challenging project in a lot of ways because, again, it was a temporary library. We had a space that was given to us from the church, and it was smaller than what their branch library had been. So we had to create, multiple types of spaces: the main reading room, places for staff, and places for like a multi-purpose room. But we also had the light coming in from the two sides. And one of the things that I think we feel really strongly about, and you'll see in all of our work, we talked about the sort of the traditional central reading room with getting natural light, but we really believe that like all kind of public spaces within and even the private spaces of the offices deserve natural light. So it was really the final design was a way in which all the rooms and as efficiently as possible that we could kind of use the light from the two walls. So here you see, again, as what David said, we sort of affectionately called the bookworm that ran through the space. And this is one other sort of element that we often bring into many of our libraries is this idea of the kind of the texts themselves.
This is a poem by Walt Whitman. It's called Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. And he wrote it when he lived in this neighborhood in Brooklyn Heights. So we kind of took the poem and we dragged it out like 100 feet long. And so you have to sort of read and return. But we love the idea of the words of Walt Whitman just sort of washing over you. You look up, you might create a different poem as you're reading this, or just seeing the words or sitting next to the wall. And then of course, as Stella was saying, also the wall itself transmitted light from all parts of the library and through the windows.
But we love the idea of incorporating the text itself within the sort of architecture of the building, and this idea of words being part of the space itself.
We'll talk about this a little bit more in other projects, but this idea of the joy of reading, we like to bring that joy right onto the surfaces of the architecture.
So here, just as you see some other images, kind of close up and far away of how that translucent wall that has the books on the bottom, or bookworm wall, allowed for light to be coming into the center area of the space, but still creating these two other private spaces where the worm wall kind of bellied out. And you here see again at the entry and reception desk. And this detail at the staff lounge on this wall that has the Walt Whitman poem. And then this was that entry that we showed before, where again, kind of creating an identity for the library within the context of the church. So then playing with the graphics along the garden wall to bring people into the library itself. So the next library we want to talk about is also in Brooklyn for Brooklyn Public Library. It's the East Flatbush Branch Library. And this project is, well, it was supposed to be done the end of the summer, but because of COVID, it's a little bit delayed, but it should be done before the end of the new year.
And so this is a really fascinating
This is a before photo.
Yeah, it's a fascinating neighborhood. It's a mostly Caribbean American, African neighborhood in Brooklyn. Very vibrant, very interesting. And the library there has been kind of, as you can see, a little bit closed off from the neighborhood. So we were just really excited to make a library that was full of light, but really open to the neighborhood, so people could walk by, look in, when they're inside, they can look out to the street.
So this was the existing library. And as you can see, in part of the ways we were talking about transparency and welcoming and light, this is not very welcoming. It's a very solid facade. You do see some glass block, but those were for private offices. So there's no real connection to that civic space, to that street space. It's not, there's, you know, not a lot that's bringing the public in and saying, come in, this is a public library for you to come and enjoy and use this space. And you can see from the interior of that existing library, similarly, there was no, you had no access to any natural light. You didn't know if it was raining outside or sunny. So we really felt like by being hired to do the renovation of this library, that it was really important to create a connection with the community at the facade and to bring in natural light. So this is the same image of that project with the new facade. So we're opening up and creating some transparency. You see into the library, there's natural light, and it welcomes you and inviting you to come into the space. The facade is a kind of pleated or corrugated facade that, again, then with the transparency at the entry that lets you see into the library itself. And we, again, kind of looked at some, playing with some text, the abstraction of text. So there's a lenticular reading on the facade when you're walking. It's very subtle when you're walking from one side of the sidewalk, because of course in New York City, you're often just going on the sidewalk. You don't get like a really long distance on the building. So this side says East Flatbush and this one says library. It's really subtle, but we kind of like the idea that if you pick up on it, you might read that as part of the text on the building itself. These are some, for those of you that are interested in architecture, these are some of the detail drawings of the assembly of that facade and how these pleated panels get put together, and then how the text is part of that kind of corrugated pattern. And some of the details, it's actually quite simple. It's really just one type of shape with the pleated, and it just gets mirrored and flipped. So we were able to be really efficient with the assembly of that facade, and then just apply the graphics. We did full-scale mock-ups of this facade. It has a perforated area as well that creates a kind of semi-private area of the facade. And so these are some of the photographs of the physical mock-ups prior to obviously the fabrication of the facade itself. As we said, it's under construction right now. So these are some photos from the fabrication shop of this like soft pleated facade. It's very kind of providing for like just that like sort of a soft pattern that allows for sort of a light and shadow that follows along that facade.
And the panels will be painted in sort of very soft grays and whites.
Right.
So the idea is to make something that's kind of ethereal and not off-putting. We hope it works.
Right. These are some of the other details. This is the physical model. So just kind of looking at the overall interior space, and the central space, which we'll show you, as we brought in these large skylights. So like the traditional libraries that we showed, to bring in natural light. And then all the other program, like actually the Brooklyn Heights with the bookworm, all the other program wraps around the perimeter, which you can kind of see in this model, what was all the sort of small volumes that are around that central space that gets shared light. So every room in the library gets light, and everyone, whether it's staff, librarians, or the public, are crossing through the central naturally lit space. So it was really important to us to create equity through light. So the organization of the library itself is also promoting this idea of light and shared space. So these are some of the plans of the library, and the idea that everyone's accessing, all doors are coming off of that main central space. So, and then sharing that light. So this is a section cut through the building, and you can see these large skylights that we've incorporated into the library that are north facing. So you're going to get a soft light. So not only opening up the facade to the street, but creating like an even light within the central portion of the library itself. So this is a rendering. We'll show you some photographs of the construction of what that interior space starts to to feel like. So really playing off some of these ideas that we're interested in with traditional libraries with the natural light, very different than what the existing space was like. And then the perimeter walls also get natural light when they're facing the facade, but the walls are also a translucent material. So there's shared light so that even the walls that aren't getting direct light from above or from the facade are getting shared light from this natural skylight.
And all of the perimeter rooms they're clad in a perforated wood. So the perforations help with sound. They mitigate transmission of sound. But the warmth of the wood will be in the smaller, more intimate spaces.
Right. And then really briefly, you know, just like the other library, we incorporated some graphics that have to do with bringing that into the library itself. So there are 2 poems that we chose that are then part of a graphic identity. So this is kind of a beautiful poem by Nikki Giovanni about what a library is. And then also another poem by Amarimi Baraka that's also incorporated into the sort of graphics. So what we did was we took these poems and then we started to sort of do a graphic pattern and enlarging that, kind of abstracting it like we did for the bookworm, created a sort of a pattern for the walls, and then incorporated that within the library itself. So in the children's area, you sort of get an abstraction and a fragmentation of these poems within the interior of the library
So
itself.
there's a series of these murals that'll occur at different places in the library.
And this is just
yeah.
a photo, a recent photo you can see of the library under construction. This is one of those skylights. So again, it should be complete, hopefully before the end of the year.
Interior spaces that Stella talked about in the beginning that had no light will now have essentially 6 big skylights, illuminating the space from above. So we're very excited about the transformation that's going to occur.
And the last one we want to show of our branch libraries is in Red Hook, Brooklyn, a very different type of neighborhood, but another branch library. And this one, we'll talk a little bit about the neighborhood itself, but again, very similar in terms of some of the ideas which you see in this first image of making a connection to the street. This library happens to have a garden as part of it, so that's really an added bonus so that we're able to incorporate plants and soften the sort of sidewalk scape and create a more transparent library for the community. But we're going to back up a little bit and talk about this neighborhood in Red Hook, Brooklyn.
Yeah, I don't know if any of you know Red Hook at all, but it's kind of a former and still sort of industrial neighborhood. There are a lot of residents there, though, as well. It was right across the street, and you see in this image where it says Red Hook houses. These are some of the very first New York City Housing Authority buildings that were ever built. They were built in the mid 1930s, and they house about 6,000 people. And there are several other thousands of people in this neighborhood as well. But the little library that you see there that says Red Hook Library is, we're going to show some images of what it looks like now, but it's a very tiny, little library, and it's almost you almost can't find it. So it doesn't have much of an identity, and so it needs an identity for people to be proud of it and to know where it is. But Stella, you want to talk about
the other aspect of this library that's significant is it's in a flood zone. So we have this challenge of creating a new renovated library, but also needing to make sure that it's waterproof, which is kind of a complicated thing to do for a building, because you essentially have to make sure that it's like a bathtub and that it can withstand a flood. So that's part of an aspect of the design. But going back to what David just said, so here it is, you saw in the aerial image, it's on the corner, which is great because many of our other libraries are between other buildings. But you can see in this existing photo of the library, you barely know that it's a library. Again, no connection to the street. There's a fence around it as well, skinny little strip lights that give you a little bit of an idea of what the weather's like outside, but not much of a connection to the street. So there's a real missed opportunity for us. And the existing entry is over towards the right, so not even facing this corner. There is this wonderful little garden on the side, but it's not connected to the building. So on the far left slide, you see that solid wall. That's the library. So they have a garden, but you have to go outside inside the library, go through this chain link fence, which you see in the upper right, and then enjoy the garden. So one of the things that Brooklyn Public Library came to us with is like, can you make a connection so that you can go from inside the library to the garden and make it part of an education center for the children and an outdoor reading area. So there's a real challenge with this library, but there's also real opportunities with this garden. This is the existing interior space. So similar to what we showed to the other library, you know, very little natural light. The light you see from the ceiling is electric light, artificial light. So again, you know, nice in many ways. It's a large room for a branch library, but not really making any connection to the neighborhood. So this is our proposed plan. So the corner of the two streets are on the up here, which is Walcott and Dwight. So this is the corner, and then the garden is here on the left-hand side. So the idea, what we decided to incorporate is like, how do we make these connections where you see in and through the building and create a more welcoming library? And one of the main things that we did also was we moved the entry to the corner. So that existing corner became a place of entry, not just something of red brick. So we make a lot of models in our office to study. So these are the images of the proposed building utilizing brick, because there's a lot of brick in the neighborhood. It's traditionally red brick. And we're looking at a kind of a salt and pepper kind of gray speckled concrete brick. So in keeping with the texture of the neighborhood, but actually changing the palette a little bit. These are some of the other photos of the model that we made as studies and presentation and representation to show Brooklyn Public Library. And then this is the now proposed library. So that's that same corner shot that we showed before. The building, you will have noticed, now has steps, and that's part of the waterproofing for the flood proofing. So we're raising the building and creating a building that will stay dry during the flood. So we had to incorporate a lot of that into the building while still creating transparency. We've removed the fence around the perimeter. We've added plants in the garden around the outside, and hopefully created what we think is a much more welcoming building. We've also been doing some studying details on the brickwork of the building itself and creating different types of texture and screens to make it kind of the play with the light and shadow. So the upper portion of the building is a kind of like a screen, and the lower portion is sort of like a basket weave.
So even though the building is made of brick, it's intended to feel light.
Mm-hmm. And these are some of the details, again, for those of you that are interested in the sort of detailing of architecture. These are some of the studies of the patterning and how that brick is laid out to achieve that look of the facade.
So we're popping out like every other brick within this pattern. And these are some studies in our model shop where we just ordered a pallet of bricks and started playing with the pattern. They're precast concrete bricks, actually. Mm-hmm. And they come in a couple different sizes where it'll play around with the pattern. These are interiors. This idea of raising the ceiling slightly, keeping more, light moving through the space. And then, as you can see all the way through in the middle, this view through to the garden. So there's this idea of always seeing through.
Yeah. And then we want to ask, all of us, the question is, this is the last slide, is just, what's next for the Free Library? I mean, it's just thinking about the history of libraries and where they are now, and the role of branch libraries and libraries as civic buildings within the city, but also the roles that they're playing. We know, I've been to New Haven Library and know about so much of the programming, the sort of business incubator spaces that have been so successful, and a lot of the outreach and the children's learning programs. And so, we're passionate about libraries, but we all want to ask the question, maybe as part of the discussion for all of us, is what do we think is next for the library? So thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the fact that you guys went into a study of libraries and the history of libraries. I think that's really fascinating, and how it sort of applies to what you guys are doing now. So I just want to open it up to questions. I have been receiving some questions as you've been talking, so I will just start if that's okay. Sure. So let's see. Getting back. Okay. So what have you encountered as barriers to community members identifying with a library as something that belongs to them?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
We do a whole series of community engagement meetings with both, the people who use libraries, the stakeholders, community members, and librarians. And believe us, they're very, very concerned with what is going to be in their library after it's renovated and what may be taken away. And so we work very closely with the client, with Brooklyn Public Library, and in New York City, the Department of Design and Construction, to have these meetings so that we understand what's important to people.
And it's so interesting. I mean, one of the things that we didn't have a chance to talk about too much about the difference between all these branch libraries. You're talking a lot about each neighborhood having its own sort of idiosyncratic character and its own community. What's so interesting to us is that we have been fortunate enough to do all these branch libraries, and they're all around 8,000 square feet. But each time we work with that individual library community, it's amazing to us how different the requirements are, like from a program standpoint. So some of the libraries will say, you know what, we really need to keep our book collection as large as possible, because for us it's really important. So that means that there's a trade-off, because the library is only so big, so then maybe there are fewer meeting rooms. And then some of our other libraries are like, no, we actually don't need to hold very much of a book collection. It's what's more important for us to have a variety of meeting spaces, because we have a lot of after school programs, we have a lot of literacy programs, we have, or we want a room. Many of the libraries are coming to us and saying, well, we want one room to be accessed after hours, so that you can close the rest of the library, but there's an entry. And then, so what's so fascinating, and that's why it's such a great question, is because it really does come from the community. So the community engagement, and we do a lot of listening meetings to kind of start the process to understand, well, what does each individual branch need? Because it's not a rubber stamp process, which I think, as you'll see too, the libraries all look quite a bit different, but that comes out of our response to the site, but also just understanding, like, what are the needs of each library. And it really is different, and it should be different, because they're different communities and different needs. So
yeah. So next one, there's a couple questions that are, I feel like are pretty similar. And I think you've kind of answered a couple of them, but this one I think sort of sticks out a little bit. So have you applied your architectural ideas to the classroom? It seems there's a lot of overlap in the needs for students as for the users of libraries.
That's funny that you say that, because when we do longer lectures, we've also been fortunate enough to do several projects, mostly at Cornell University, where we've done academic spaces. And it's very similar, actually. I feel like the libraries have become more like learning spaces and schools, and then schools have also become, like, within the schools themselves, the departments have become less siloed. So we've done spaces, learning spaces and classroom spaces, where it's not, oh, this is only for the biology department and separate from this other department. They're starting to create a lot of overlap. So I think there are ways in which I think both libraries and education spaces are looking for flexibility, which isn't to say generic spaces, just flexibility. So we find that we kind of we need to provide for small intimate spaces where maybe 2 or 4 people can meet, and then middle-sized spaces where you can have a group of 6 or 8 people can meet, and then like a large meeting room where the community can meet, or there can be a classroom or a seminar. And I think the way that programs for libraries are changing are so similar to education spaces.
It's so incredibly similar. But we've not designed classroom spaces for small children. We're designing a lot of these spaces in libraries for small children. We've only worked at the university scale, but as Stella said, there's a lot of similarity just in the way, learning is changing. And the spaces for learning at all these different levels needs to change and respond to these ways that we're seeing that the culture is moving when it thinks about learning spaces. It's a great question.
And I imagine a lot of the sort of like natural light and the interplay between the street and how that all, and inviting spaces all kind of go together too.
Yeah, because even in spaces of learning, I mean, at whatever level, and as David said, we've done, our experience has been more at the university level, but it would be applicable to grade school level and primary school, is that, it's so much, it's important to understand what the other part of your environment is. I mean, there's at the kind of younger kids, you have to worry, I think, a little bit about being distracted, but we like creating, you know, the sort of visual transparency with acoustic privacy. So you need to be able to have the quietness of and the privacy, but it's really informative to understand as part of a building of a community, to understand what other people are doing and not to feel isolated. There's certainly needs for times where you need to have spaces that are very, very private and not transparent.
But we found that
but-
you can create layering where
Right.
the public part of a learning space can be connected to, let's say, corridors, which we think of as maybe closed off. But if we open them up, then people who are, doing another type of learning may see what's happening in that type of learning space. But if there's sort of a layering, then you can still create that privacy where focused learning can take place while an overall understanding of, the community essentially can be played out in the architecture. They can facilitate it.
Not isolated off.
Yeah.
So I think this is interesting, this question in particular, because it relates to kind of what we do, but I am curious how you guys approached it. Are there any differences in how you approach the design for children's spaces within libraries versus adult library spaces in terms of promoting access and community engagement?
Yeah,
Yes.
there's huge differences, not just scale, because obviously children are smaller.
Color.
Yeah.
Color and softer materials. But I think, I mean, there's certain things that are even just to do with security, needing to make sure there's greater security.
Yeah, where
and
the children
observation.
get placed
Yeah.
in the
library
organization
itself.
of library
Right.
is a very important.
And a super sensitive issue, and one that's really important. So the
Yeah.
children's spaces are never near the front door. They never need to be, from a safety standpoint, all the spaces need to be visible from the library, but that one the most. But from a design standpoint and from the enjoyment and the encouragement of children for reading, I think we try and create very engaged spaces. A lot of times, which we didn't have any images of here, but like even the walls themselves as things that can be user graphics and, and ways in which there can be a group, like story time. There are creative activities. I mean, some of the areas that we find with the children's spaces, they're doing everything from arts and crafts to story time to sort of individual sort of quiet reading to then
and lunches
and then lunches and then after school programs and then teaching children how to then being on the computer and different kinds of programs like that, which is different. I think one of the things that we have gotten very sensitive to, that within the kind of idea of community and blending, it's also really, really important that the children's section has its own identity, that the teens have their own sort of area, that the teens and the kids don't necessarily want. So we find that, like, where do you put the adults? Where do you put the teens? Then we have tweens, and then there are children.
School age
and then
children.
School-age children.
The short span of time we know.
So it's kind of like the libraries themselves. Like, they need to each have a space that feels like their own. I think what's important for us as designers to just create a sense of space and place. And so sometimes it happens within the building itself, but also within the different user groups of children, adults, tweens, and teens. And they need to feel like it's their library. And each of them have different sort of demands, from acoustic to access to what the space is like. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think the point for us is that, the spaces for the adults is not the same as the spaces for the children. That seemed really obvious, but that to be sort of sensitive to what those different needs are.
Yeah, I think that struck a chord with a couple of us of separating it out from the younger kids to the older kids, because they have different identities, and you kind of have to approach it differently.
The teens don't want to be near the kids because they're like teens.
Right.
They want to be, but then you have to be careful if they're too close to the adults, because then they're making too much of a racket. So we let the teens sort of be usually in a space where it's okay for them to be a little bit more open, and they're kind of more social and boisterous. And then places where the adults can have their quiet, and then places where the children can kind of have their place. So it's really important to kind of think about not just the library itself, but all the constituents and everyone who's participating.
Great. So I have two more, if that's all right with you guys.
Sure.
So do you have any thoughts on the architecture of the Beinecke Rare Books Library at Yale in relation to everything you just spoke about?
Well, the Beinecke is really interesting because you know, it's, it's sort of, it's really low when you walk in, but it does sort of, it is an idea about openness to the plaza. And those are just, some of the kind of like very basic ideas that you've heard us talk about in terms of like where and how a library sits in its site in the city.
I mean, it's very interesting, yeah, in terms of the way that
Yeah.
it sits. For those of you that are familiar, obviously being in New Haven, yeah, I think urbanistically, in a lot of ways, it has more promise to me in my experience of it than the way that it actually performs. So I love the sunken courtyard space, but it's blocked off and mostly for just the sculpture. So it feels a little bit sometimes like a missed opportunity. I feel like it would be nice to be able to get into that courtyard space. It is a private library, obviously, as part of the university. So in that sense, it's significantly different in that it's private. From the architecture standpoint itself, I think it's quite beautiful in the way that the sort of, just obviously it's for the rare books. So there's a way in which the books are set off. But it's in the sort of the way that the public space rings around that center, and that the way they use the stone and the sort of translucency of the stone to bring in light while still protecting the books, I think is actually quite beautiful. There's many aspects of the architecture itself, and structurally it's fascinating. And urbanistically, as David said, the way it sits within the campus. I've, in my experience, David went to Yale actually, so maybe you remember a little bit more. I've, in my experience, visiting there probably 3 or 4 times, I've never seen that plaza be super active. And so I feel like it could, but maybe I've just been there at the wrong
If it was sort of like, I mean, it's very similar in a sense to the Pompidou Center library in that there's a big plaza in front of it. And if it's a public library, that would have the opportunity to be, much more, let's say, more utilized. So it's a very architecturally beautiful library, but it's quite precious.
All right, so our last one is there research or tracking being done on the relationship between library design and actual use?
Well,
I think there's a
working
lot,
with our client, Brooklyn Public Library, they do a lot of data, a lot of tracking. They know, which libraries have, more circulation, more usage by teens, more by young children, more by adults. And they're very different, as Stella was saying, depending on the neighborhood. And they program really, it's quite impressive, actually. They program quite specifically to their populations. You'll see even in the types of languages of books that are in the library, they're tailored to that neighborhood. So there may be, a population is more Spanish speaking, and there's just a lot of Spanish books, or Asian languages. And then again, the programming, like if there are a lot of seniors in that neighborhood, like in New Utrecht, they have a lot of programming for senior citizens. So we've been, again, really impressed by how they track and then respond to that tracking.
Did that influence why they decided to renovate specific ones?
Exactly.
Very much so.
Exactly.
Yeah. There's a lot of factors. I mean, some, the buildings are in need of repair.
They're falling apart. Yeah.
Others, and that just goes with the maintenance of buildings, and especially in civic spaces. Sometimes there's long periods of neglect due to economies or whatever. But then when they decide to renovate, they look very carefully at, the needs of the neighborhood. And what may be either in place or changing or coming up.
But I think that is why they're all different. They all have their own like identity, both like their physical identity, but like their programming identity. Like some of them, as David said, are like geared towards seniors, and the program we've seen like knitting program. I mean, like they'll do all kinds of programs that are then more geared towards that, because that particular library has a strong population, or for whatever reasons there's like a larger constituency that's visiting the library in certain age groups, or it depends. And that for us, that's fun, because it's not like, oh, we're doing the same, it's another branch library, we just do the same thing we did in the other one. It's like we're meeting a whole different community of people. The programming, even though it's all often Brooklyn Public Library, we're doing one for Queens now, but it's like, okay, this is different now. We're dealing with a different sort of community of people. And that, for us, that makes it really fun and interesting because they're all actually quite different.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's it for questions, and I really appreciate you guys staying on a little bit after time.
Sure.
So I just want to say thank you so much for joining us, David and Stella. I really appreciate it.
Thank
We
you.
will be sending out a link to everybody, putting it on our website. I know that, maybe a few architecture students, and I'm thinking of, would really benefit from watching this as well. Most of you know that my husband is in the Yale Architecture School, so
I do.
I know you do. But I really appreciate you guys being here. And thank you all for participating today too. Thank you for the lovely questions. Those were great. And please join us next Saturday for Dr. Julie Washington's lecture on using culturally relevant reading materials to promote interest in reading among underserved students. I totally butchered that. That is so many little R's in there. But please register on our website if you haven't already. It's going to be a great discussion next Saturday.
Great.
Thank
Sounds
you.
great. What
Thanks
a
so
great
much.
program too.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're so
Thanks for
honored to be
letting us
part of this
come talk to
program.
you guys, and thank you
Yeah,
for
yeah.
coming to listen to us today.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
really appreciate it, you guys. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Yeah,
great.
bye.
Thanks.
Bye.